Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series. We have been running a series 2 weeks ago, and then this is part 2 of Mastering TCO with Databricks. If you missed part 1, we started off by the topic of getting your house in order. And if you know anything about Databricks, Blueprint has been a partner of Databricks for many years, and we want to really bring some really great information over to you on why it is so important and to understand your TCO when it comes to technology. And today we are going to be talking about building a solid foundation. If you missed part 1 again, don't worry about it. Our president and CEO, Ryan Neal, will give a quick recap on what you missed. We also have the recording to that on our YouTube page, so be sure to be following us on our social platforms to see all of the latest updates on there. We want to welcome any questions that you have, so feel free to add them in the comments and we will ask them live. And Ryan will give us some great information for you to take home. So without further ado, Ryan, kick it off.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to attend. This webinar, as Ruthie mentioned, it's called Building a Solid Foundation, the Financial Benefits of Data Governance and Data Democratization. So this is number 2 in the 3-part series where we talk about total cost of ownership, or TCO, of a data estate and the importance of quantifying all the aspects of data access and governance. As Ruthie mentioned, if you haven't viewed webinar number 1 and haven't signed up for our webinar number 3, please do when you get a chance. This is the where we're at in part 2 right now, building a solid foundation, and the part 3 in accelerating growth is in 2 weeks. So we got a little bit of feedback from the webinar number 1 to move a little bit more slowly through this because some of these concepts are pretty complicated. We try to keep it pretty high level because you can really get into a lot of the details and a lot of the complexity when you're talking about total cost of ownership of anything, but also a data estate. So definitely feel free, and I highly encourage you to ask questions if things don't make sense, if you want me to go over anything, or if you want me to dive a little bit deeper into any of the topics. I will disqualify or have a disclaimer. I'm not an accountant. I'm very far from it. I'm an entrepreneur. So this very much is a total cost of ownership from an entrepreneurship perspective and from a business perspective around these different concepts. As Ruthie mentioned, I'm Ryan Neal, CEO of Blueprint Technologies. We are a digital intelligence solutions and products provider that specializes in helping companies get the most out of their data estates and the most out of their data assets. So we believe that companies operate their best when they are able to deliver the right data to the right people at the right time. And a huge importance of that is having a very, very good modern data estate that supports your data strategy, that supports your business strategy. So that's we connect the strategy to delivery and the productization and automation of all the aspects of a data estate. So we're going to recap real quick and build off of webinar number 1. So webinar number 1 was all about getting your house in order. And I understand the kind of a little bit of a flip of building a foundation once your house is in order sounds a little bit flipped, but most of our customers and most people in a situation when they're dealing with any kind of execution on a data strategy, they already have a set of legacy technology that they've invested in. They already have a house that they're trying to manage. And so, before you actually then try to do any kind of a remodel or renovation, you have to make sure that house is somewhat in order, that you know who you're working with in order to find a really good path forward. So the prior webinar number 1 was all about those aspects of understanding what you're working with. And first and foremost, we talk about the basic principles of TCO. It sounds very simple on its face, but the fundamentals are actually highly complex or can be complex. And we try to boil it down into very consumable components. And we'll talk about what that formula looks like and what the important aspects of those, the formula is. We also talked about how the TCO analysis applies to your legacy data estate, how it also builds the case for moving to a modern data estate, and what the difference about how we define legacy versus modern in this context. We also talked about the case for vendor consolidation, even in times of high cost of capital, when typically you would be thinking about putting some kind of vendor consolidation on pause. And then we also discussed the pros and cons of choosing the right hyperscaler, especially in the scenario of modernizing your data estate. And then we calculated the high ROI impact at scale of using an open architecture platform like Databricks versus a low ROI impact at scale of some of the alternatives. And we gave a very practical example, anonymized from one of our clients. So make sure you go back and take a look at that webinar #1. The video is accessible, and if you have any questions on it, feel free to reach out to me directly. You can either email me directly or connect with me on LinkedIn, and both are very easy. All right. So now we're going to discuss some of the fundamental elements of a data estate that are necessary for making really good fiscal decisions inside the context of your data strategy. So this is going to be a little bit of a departure from just the nuts and bolts of the data estate itself. That was much more about analyzing kind of where you were at in webinar #1. This is going to be much more about how do you actually quantify the aspects that impact your data strategy, and as well the decisions that you need to make to be able to align that data strategy with your overall business strategy to be able to justify and quantify the business impact. So first, let's recap the overall concept of a TCO of a data estate. So the TCO of a data estate is the sum of all costs associated with acquiring, operating, customizing, and maintaining the data estate over its lifetime. And there's a lot of different costs that are associated with that. And you have to be able to take into consideration the concept of a data estate's lifetime, because it is a constantly changing organism within your environment. Changes every single minute, every single day, as you add new users, as you add different personas, as your business has different needs and different asks of the use of the technology. And so you need to be able to have a concept of how you actually take that into consideration on the front, versus chasing your tail, constantly trying to do a forecast versus actual on a quarterly basis, from looking back on what happened in the prior quarter. I can't tell you how many clients and customers that we have that their standard practice of evaluating TCO of a technology investment is a quarterly look back of forecast versus actual. And the amount of time and effort they spend just to do that calculation, and it's almost impossible to be able to marry those up, because they're not looking forward. These are the kind of the fundamentals that you want to take into consideration when you're projecting out and trying to control and predict that scale up over time. So also CapEx versus OpEx. It's incredibly important to understand the difference between the two, and especially the impact they have on your P&L and balance sheet, as well as cash flow. So the capital expenses are the type of costs that you incur that you're going to be able to invest and create assets that your company is going to be able to use over time. And the important part about the CapEx aspect of things is that you'll take a typical OpEx expense and categorize it in a build fashion to be able to put it on your balance sheet and depreciate it over time. I'll talk a little bit about about the effect on earnings and EBITDA and profit and the difference between the two. I heard a really good quote from one of our clients that talked about the difference between build versus buy, and we definitely evaluate and recommend different strategies on build versus buy depending on the overall business strategy, the data strategy that supports that, but then also the maturity and the level at which the company's operating and what they can support. And the important part, the quote was, you build to innovate and you buy to accelerate. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of the aspects of both and the importance of it to the business and what your stage of maturity is. But most of the individuals that are moving into any kind of a modern data estate scenario should take a serious consideration around the build aspect of it, because of the fact that you can actually capitalize the build portion of modernizing your data estate. And not just on a one-time basis, you have the ability to actually build additional assets and data products and be able to capitalize those as well, versus having them be a straight up operating expense. The importance that is that in any kind of a financial situation, when you have any kind of a board of directors, if you've taken VC, PE investment, if you are have a even if you're a nonprofit or if you're publicly traded, you want to make sure that you try to minimize the impact of these technology upgrades on your earnings and your EBIT or EBITDA line. And if you're able to actually capitalize the build out portion of modernizing your data estate, typically on we went over this in webinar number 1, on a 5-year amortization basis from to be able to depreciate the asset, it is a fraction of the cost of operating your data estate that hits that will actually hit your net income line versus your EBITDA line. So you want to take a look at that very heavily and try to capitalize as much as you can in this type of a situation. The next category is direct costs versus indirect costs. So you have to be able to take into a lot of people, one of the mistakes they make when they're trying to calculate total cost of ownership of a data estate is they typically will go just straight to the direct costs because they're easy to quantify, right? It's how much is the infrastructure going to cost, and I can take a look at my cloud provider and get rates, and I can do a calculation of usage and the different subscriptions and those kind of things. I can also take into consideration my software costs and all the licensing, and I can take a look at cloud services, and I can try to quantify those about how many I'm going to be used and how many are have dependencies on the data estate. I can also take a look at my SaaS products that are going to be in the ecosystem that I can try to roll in. And then the other aspect is labor. Not only from a FTE standpoint, but from an SI partner that you'll potentially use, or a GSI partner if you're going to use one of them as well. So those are the easier quantifiable direct costs. What we're going to talk about today, and if you remember from webinar number 1, I'll show you on the next slide, is those the multiplier effect of considerations within the data estate, and the majority of those are driven by your indirect costs, and we'll get into that next. So the TCO calculation that we use is what we talked about before, is your CapEx versus your OpEx, and you're going to be able to take your CapEx from a amortized basis and add it to your OpEx. But then you want to take into consideration the inflation rate and then the growth rate. The growth rate is not the growth of your company. The growth rate is tied to the growth of your data estate. So it's a direct derivative of your data strategy and what your company needs are going to be over the life of the data estate from a growth standpoint. You also want to take into consideration, you multiply that by the level of complexity of your data. And on the growth and complexity side of things, that is a truth that is out there right now, is data is getting more and more complex. Companies are using more and more complex data as it becomes accessible. And the volume of that data is not only accumulating over time, but becoming more accessible over time. So the growth of the data estate is a fairly considerable one to take into consideration, and the complexity as well. And then the other one we're going to talk about today is the risk. So that's one of the biggest factors that a lot of chief data officers and chief technology officers and a lot of the people that are owning the technology strategy, the data strategy, don't take into consideration is the quantification of the financial impact of risk. You can see the direct costs underneath: infrastructure, software, cloud services, labor. The SaaS products are in there as well, and then the indirect costs. From a data movement standpoint, there's also the ingress and egress of data in your data estate. You have data storage and processing that oftentimes will increase exponentially. And then you have the cost of data latency, and that's one I love to talk about with my team is the business impact of data latency, and the fact that you can actually that you can quantify that on a labor from a management standpoint, but then also you can tie that directly to an impact on revenue and profitability. So all in all, the biggest aspect of total cost of ownership, and what people struggle with justifying the most, is whether or not your data estate is going to be a benefit to the organization, or if it's going to be a burden to the organization. And most of the folks that are in attendance, I can tell by the titles that you have and the companies that you work for, you are in many of those conversations, either on the front end, trying to justify the business case and the business justification to be able to modernize, or you're either mid or on the back end trying to justify it retroactively about whether or not what kind of benefit your major cost is going to drive. A very easy scenario is that with the economy the way it is right now, and many of you are right in the middle of these discussions, is you will have a non-technical business leader or a financial leader saying, how could I justify giving you $5 million to modernize our data estate when we just lost $5 million last quarter? That conversation is happening with many of our clients right now, many companies out there. And typically what they do is they make a really poor decision of they will actually stop technology development and then lay off individuals, lay off labor, because that's where they can strip they can strip out of their SG&A much easier. And what they end up doing is making a short-term cut that sacrifices their overall long-term success. So in our eyes, both of those are bad. There's much better ways to approach it, and that's what this webinar is really talking about. So let's talk about a couple of the components that that people throw around, but we're gonna dive in a little bit more in depth to actually talk about the financial impact of the importance of prioritizing these two concepts that power the intangible costs that are associated with the TCO of a data estate. So we have data democratization. So it's one of the, other than I guess digital transformation, it's one of the kind of the most overused buzzwords in our industry that we see, because most people use it almost interchangeably with any kind of a BI scenario, dashboarding scenario, but they don't really understand or they can't really dive into, first and foremost, what are the components of it, and then second, how do you actually get that done? So our definition, so we want to be able to enable all members of the organization to be able to access, understand, analyze, and disseminate data independently of IT. That's the important part, is you take data access out of the realm of traditional IT, and then you really drive that data-driven culture, not only inside but outside your organization. Every single organization has data sharing strategic initiatives, And whether it be a franchise with third-party franchise organizations, or it might be vendors that you want to share information with. It might be a supply chain scenario where you have a bunch of logistics partners that you want to share information with. And then you want to be able to have them be able to make decisions on their actual judgment versus gut, which we see oftentimes. So the business value of data democratization is really around powering revenue and growth, which equates to revenue and increased revenue and growth on controlling costs, drives profitability and increases in your operating profit. So enabling self-service analytics and has that better decision making at the edge, at the business user. And then enabling that data-driven decision making is actually accurate decision making versus what most people they make decisions based on gut. And I'll give you a quick scenario of a story, an actual real life story. So in this scenario around a data democratization effort, is we were engaged with one of our clients when they were just starting their journey to move from one of the major cloud providers to another and modernize their systems. And one of the things that we do as part of our start with the modernization journey is we do a course of action assessment. And one of our major stakeholders that we identified was the chief marketing officer. And she had mentioned that, in a high velocity retail situation, they were trying to measure the daily impact of sales in particular regions, in particular stores, in particular categories at particular times of the day. And her scenario and her frustration was that the analytics function was actually controlled by not only IT, but it was controlled by accounting and finance because it was sales data. And the stated SLA for the delivery of that data was 30 days. So that was the commitment to the business, that they would deliver financial data within 30 days. And it makes sense. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a little bit kind of an old school way to think about it. But a typical accounting department doesn't need to look at data and information on anything really less than a 1 month increment. So that's how they actually have a way of working and delivering that out to the business, because it has a monthly period and a quarterly period and a yearly period that they analyze. But for this chief marketing officer, she needed that sales data on a daily basis, and ideally on a half daily or hourly basis, and wasn't able to get it. So she didn't have any when she's designing and running her campaigns, didn't have any information about how she was going to be able to actually do it. So I asked her how she actually made those decisions. She had just by gut feel, and then I pick up the phone and call my stores. So you think about the amount of disconnect and lack of data-driven decision making. It's great because her gut was really good. She'd been in the company for a long time, but what happens if she changes out and you have somebody that's brand new? It's also one of our retailers that said, their best asset in inventory and supply chain management was a good store manager, because they knew the store and the flows in and out of the data without having to get access to the data. But those are really, really, they can oftentimes have really bad impacts on the business overall, especially from a stability and consistency standpoint. So really, the data democratization is really designed. It's designed first and foremost to promote productivity and innovation, but also it's incredibly important to promote customer and employee satisfaction. That's the other thing that a lot of people don't take into consideration is the impact on employees when they don't have access to the right information at the right time, when they're trying to make interest in the best or decisions in the best interest of the company. It's one of the biggest things that we see from an employee morale standpoint, and why people will switch is because they're asked to go around and gather up data and shuffle it around and analyze it and try to build these dashboards. And oftentimes when they deliver it out to the business, they hear crickets, because what happens is the cost drivers on the other side, time and money, First and foremost, you spend a ton of time and labor dollars, either employee or vendor or partner dollars, just for the ingress and egress of data. So one of our key leaders always talks about the data movement tax. And the data movement tax is not only from the cost of actually moving that data with all your systems and all the hops that the data moves to. And if you remember from my prior webinar, I showed the spaghetti diagram of every single one of those arrows, which is a data movement event. Each one of those arrows in the spaghetti diagram is a data movement event. So each of those hops from system to system cost money, literal subscriptions or payments to providers. But then there's also the labor that it takes for people to manage that, each of those hops, manage things like data quality, duplication, all those different aspects. So the organizations end up spending a lot of additional money on managing those scenarios that they wouldn't necessarily have to. Also, data latency. The amount of effort to be able to spend time to deliver sales data to that chief marketing officer when it becomes a 30-day lag, so a 30-day SLA, that latency by definition renders that data irrelevant because it has such a lag and such a disconnect on a 30-day basis from the event that happened. That data, if she makes decisions based on that 30-day-old data, that is a condition that does not exist in the business anymore. And she would actually be making incorrect decisions or a roll of the dice on the craps table of business that hopefully you're going to be able to have the same condition happening 30 days later and making that same decision. The other aspect is data duplication, right? The amount of data duplication that we see in most legacy data estates is frankly, it's astounding in this day and age, but it's incredible that each different department and domain and corporate organization still believes and holds on to this legacy perspective that they are a sovereign entity, that their data is theirs, that they own their data, and that it is unique and particular to their business, which requires duplication around all the different silos. We have one of our clients has 14 different domains, and they all maintain the same set or a variation of the customer data, because they're all trying to service the customer. And what ends up in we got hired to do an analysis of the customer experience because everybody maintained all their different data in separate environments and duplicate environments. And on one transaction, the customer got 144 spam emails or direct mail emails from that transaction, which was a really bad customer experience. And then what we talked about, the data accuracy versus irrelevance. In this world, when you're trying to have the data estate be a justifiable asset that powers the data strategy, that powers the business strategy, most people running data estates, they believe kind of in an old school mentality that my job is just to ingest, create the pipelines, and then deliver it onto the other side in some form or fashion that the consumer is going to want internally. And what they do is they end up absolving themselves from any kind of accuracy of the data. And that ends up making, it's one of the biggest causes that we see of making a data estate irrelevant and the data questionable from each of our customers. So data democratization has a huge benefit to customers, but what you really have to have is you have to have a unified data estate to really be able to achieve it. Second, we'll talk about data and governance. So data governance is near and dear to my heart. We've spent a lot of time in the realm, and what we see is a lot of customers don't prioritize it. It actually oftentimes data governance and data privacy by extension is a compliance organization that comes in after the fact and performs audits and slows down the business and has gate checks of decision makings that the tech leaders need to comply with, and it basically slows down the pace of the business. We think of it a little bit more in a proactive standpoint, where data governance is actually really critical to be able to ensure the stability and the reliability of a data estate. It's the process of governing the collection, storage, management, and utilization of data within an organization. And it is responsible for ensuring accuracy, consistency, reliability, security, and compliance with all the different regulations that are particular to the business. And a big portion of what we see data governance that data governance is in the actual definition for us of optimization. So you have to be able to, any kind of a data estate, you have to have appropriate monitoring and the ability to audit in a system to be able to find the evidence of aspects of monitoring and non-compliance within the systems themselves to be able to actually then provide data quality and performance assurance. So those are the aspects of data governance that are all incredibly important. It's why we've invested so heavily in one of our flagship products, the Lakehouse Optimizer, LHO, and why data governance is a part of that product, and it's rising. Our customers are asking more and more and more for it because of that monitoring, cost calculation aspect, but also then the ability to flag, recommend, and then them be able to find the evidence and audit when things are out of compliance. So the business exposure is really centered around risk of loss. So, and risk of loss is typically a term in kind of the insurance world, but we try to counsel our customers to be able to think of risk of loss of, when you boil it down, is, what's the business value of an outage? What's the business value of a hack? What is the business value of a breach? And we try to talk about data governance that fits into the category of, you can negotiate as good of a deal as you want with all of the cloud providers. Huge win. We went to Azure and we negotiated an 80% discount on our ACR. Great. Awesome. We went to our different providers and we went to Databricks and we negotiated a big discount. So we're saving all this money. All of that money all that savings can be wiped away in one breach. That's just from an actual tech standpoint of what you need to do to restart and rebuild your system once there's a breach or once there's a hack. But then you take into consideration all of the aspects of the fines and the audits and the money you have to spend to be able to upgrade your compliance aspect of things. So we try to make sure that it's done proactively, and that everybody understands the business impact that data governance has, that has nothing in the data estate world, has very little to do with compliance. It really has to do with some of the actual benefits of risk and liability avoidance, and then the data consolidation and visibility. So data governance is directly tied to data democratization and powers all those revenue and growth scenarios that we talked about on the data democratization slide. Without data governance and really good proactive data governance, it's almost impossible to get any kind of data democratization, or if you even break it down and don't try to be that aspirational, any kind of good BI scenarios, any kind of advanced use of advanced technology. It's almost impossible for most organizations that have any kind of a complex organizational structure. So the cost drivers are really, it's time and money when you boil it down to it. But each of the time and the aspects of time and money are a little bit nuanced. So, we talked about data breaches, but you need to take into consideration fraud, and fraud exists in every single business, both internal and external fraud. errors in decision making and the compounding impact that those errors can make, the redundancy and inconsistency of within a data estate. And then we talked about data movement, which is also an impact of data governance. The more movement you have of data, the harder it is to govern. So we like to, our data management suite is designed to leave the data where it needs to be, as close to the user as possible, and then just manage the access to it, which is a lot easier than shuffling it around and moving it to the different organizations. And then last but not least, it's compliance. I put that last but not least because I am, as my entire team knows, I'm not the compliance person. I actually bristle at compliance. I bristle at the concept. I realize it's necessary. It has a very high monetary component to it, but I wish everybody would just take more of a proactive approach to compliance. And that's way, in our opinion, it's a much better approach to handling compliance than a look back audit approach. So cool. So let's talk about, I hope this is big enough on the screen. If not, I'll talk about it more specifically. So this is, let's talk about the case for unification on Databricks. So the case for unification is fairly simple when you take a look at it from outside looking in, but if you dive into each of the components, it can be fairly nuanced and complex. And so I'm going to talk about the basic components, and this is an actual Databricks whiteboard drawing that I think does it incredibly well. We actually have an exercise that we can walk each of the attendees through if you want with this whiteboarding exercise. It's not Databricks in particular, although since we're a Databricks partner and this is really centered around mastering TCO with Databricks, anybody attending that is a Databricks user, if you've chosen Databricks to be your partner of choice in your data estate, you should definitely run through this with us. We do a complimentary. And then also anybody that's considering it from an alternative, you should really run through this, because once you map this out, and especially in comparison to some of the other alternatives, you just really start to see the business value of the data estate. It becomes pretty clear. The main thing I'll draw your attention to is, kind of the upper left, it's all around the kind of your overall data strategy and the different components of your data strategy and how they're actually linked to your business strategy. In the bottom left, that's where you see the kind of the current state of most people's data estate. So typically what the data estate will be is centered around that time and money icons. And right below it, it just shows a very simple drawing of a data warehouse, a data lake, and the silos from a governance standpoint that need to happen. And anytime you have those siloed data warehousing or those siloed data lakes, whether it be organizationally, you might have it from a corporate structure standpoint, you might have it from a geographic regional standpoint, or you might just have it because you inherited a legacy data estate that at one time looked at the business by department or by business line, and then each is maintaining its own data warehouse. That is where you have the high duplication and high labor cost. So that scenario, depending on how many you have, and you can see in the drawing it says n equals 15, we'll give you a scenario around that. That is where the cost to maintain and manage those is incredibly high. And that is one aspect of the case of unification. You can see in kind of the bottom right, the data maturity desires and the data maturity curve. If you have a data structure and a data state that's structured like the one in the bottom left, it's almost impossible to get any kind of maturity out of your data state because the cost to be able to manage that legacy data estate over its lifetime of the data estate, especially when you layer on any kind of new use cases, any new lines of business, any kind of additional sources of revenue, or especially any kind of new technology capability, like utilizing something like Gen AI Gen BI, any of those scenarios, that ends up being incredibly cost prohibitive. And what ends up happening in your business is your business ends up sitting on the sidelines and waiting to not be a first mover. They end up waiting for hopefully their technology either catches up or they can potentially leapfrog. There's some other scenario, or that the business will just improve enough that they'll be able to prioritize the capital expense and the operating expense to modernize. On the upper right is really the data estate and the capabilities that are existing within Databricks. So you have the future state enablement, risk reduction in the center. You have a cost reduction because you have consolidation, not only internal of data consolidation, but also vendor consolidation. So keep in mind, for every single one of those separate systems that they're running, it's a ton of vendors that oftentimes are going to be specialty vendors, or they're going to be legacy vendors. And the legacy vendors, their cost profile goes like this. So they're going to be way more expensive than they were on the front end of the deal that you put together with them, because they are the incumbent, and oftentimes they try to make more money on the back end than on the front end. And a very easy scenario is what one of the additional hyperscalers is moving in right now. We're giving a lot backloading cloud deals. So, the company is able to take a short-term benefit on the first year of a 5-year deal. But then if you do the math on the TCO of the data estate all up, in most scenarios, on a 5-year amortization basis, it can be way more expensive, especially as the company scales. And I talked about that in the last webinar, and I'll talk about it in a little bit as we move towards the end of this webinar. The big thing that we want to talk about, though, is that unified approach to security governance, and it has to do with the Unity catalog. And the benefits of something like utilizing something like the Unity catalog to govern all access within even Delta sharing inside and outside your organization, and regardless of your workspaces, the amount of workspaces, regardless the amount of departments that you have. So let's do some math, and this is really basic because I don't like math. I don't like doing this stuff. Primarily, I like doing it at a real basic level, and I definitely don't like doing accounting. So this is, if you remember from the last webinar, if you attended, this is the overview of just a simple justification for a current state of a legacy data estate moving to a modernization on Databricks alone. So this is the scenario that I gave, where you only have on a typical basis, you'd look at if you take a look in the upper right on the future state, that jump up in cost of the migrate and build of a modern data estate all up. Typically what you'd look at is you'd say, well, Ryan, I can't justify to go from a legacy data estate that costs me on an operating basis $1.2 million a year to one that costs me $1.2+ million per year on an annual basis, and you're telling me I have to spend an additional $2.1 million to get there. That doesn't make any financial sense, and I totally understand that. The important part is those assumptions and the complexities down below are incredibly important to take a look at. And all I did was very simple multiplier effect of taking the risk factor of 4 of a legacy data estate and reducing it in half. So there is an additional risk factor with any data estate, but when you're actually on a modern data estate, especially when you have certain providers in place, because of their capabilities, you can decrease your risk considerably. Ruthie, was there a question?
Yeah, we had a question come through. This one says, is there an angle on avoiding vendor lock-in? where Unity Catalog can also support a consolidation of data vendors? And if so, how could that work?
100%. Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you. It's one of the aspects that we touched on in the previous webinar, but I didn't actually showcase an example of the vendor consolidation versus vendor lock-in, and especially with something like Unity Catalog, does it play well with others? So a little bit vendor lock-in is a little bit of a fallacy in the tech and the business world, because it's only a true concept in relation to the amount of money, time, and effort it takes to actually get off of a platform, and the amount of upstream, downstream, and internal and external dependencies that the organization has chosen to make as an investment in the platform. So I'll give you one quick scenario of one of the things that we specialize in, and we love to do and we hate to do it, is Oracle migrations. We are not an Oracle partner. They've been around for a long time, and they are one of the more egregious vendor lock-in companies. At one point, we believe their technology was needed in the world, but what they ended up doing is, not only from a technology standpoint, but from a contractual standpoint, ended up intertwining multiple different organizations' tie outs to contracts. And that's one of those ones that's kind of the more difficult vendor lock-in scenarios to get out of it, because you have to then negotiate as an organization business owner to say, hey, I want to get off of this platform and I want to move to Azure Data Services, or I want to move into AWS off of Oracle, and I want to detach my financial systems from this, or whatever scenario is that you're using for Oracle. And then you have to negotiate with a different business owner, because they say, well, you can't get off of your system, because if you do, then my contract's going to be canceled. Outside of those scenarios, which are relatively rare, and they're usually, we only see them really when it's in an Oracle or an SAP, kind of those big monolithic appliances that have been around for a long time. Otherwise, the actual switching cost is something that you should be considering on every 2-year basis. Just like if you come from the traditional data center paradigm of equipment upgrades, on an every 2-year cycle, if you switch, the cost of upgrading that on the if you skip a cycle, the cost of upgrading on that 4-year basis is exponentially higher, not linearly higher. Right. And so you should be taking a look at that on an every 2-year basis, and be able to be proactive about switching. And I understand, I mean, the migration fatigue and system switching fatigue is a very real for not only tech users, but also the business users that are impacted. That is particularly why you need a really good migration or an SI partner that is heavily invested in accelerators to be able to speed through the process and minimize the impact of switching over in the migration process from one to the other, with highest amount of speed, highest amount of quality, and minimal business impact. Specifically, though, when you're talking about Unity Catalog, so Unity Catalog, the best part about why we love the partnership with Databricks is they're one of the few companies that we've seen, especially in this space, that started with an open source mentality and still maintains it over time. At Data and AI Summit, Ali, the CEO, and all the leaders said, "Oh, we have a full, firm commitment ongoing to the open source mentality, the open source perspective. It's a beautiful thing. And it's a really difficult thing to do from a business standpoint, because most often, especially if you've taken VC money, if you're trying to go public, if you're trying to do any of that kind of stuff, supporting open source perspective is a really difficult thing to do. And then when you're publicly traded, it's really tough for even a big company like Microsoft to really get its head around, and then also support and be a driver of The best part about something with partnering with Databricks that we believe, and we're a partner, but we're also tech agnostic. We are that independent third party that evaluates all the tech around the industry, and then we settle on the one that we think is best out there. Is Unity Catalog can not only plays well with others. So if you've made a heavy investment in some other external Metastore, or if you actually have a heavily investment in some other ISV partner or cataloging, access management, any of those things, it oftentimes will either have they've invested pretty heavily in direct integrations. Or the best part about it is they have a whole set of functionality that allow to be able to exchange of information and the data back and forth. And then you have the ability to be able to move off of something like Unity Catalog if you do so choose to. And you should evaluate that on a regular basis. We believe that competition in this space is good for everybody, and that vendor lock-in is good for one company. It's bad for the rest of the ecosystem. Feel free to throw another comment in if I missed any aspects of your question that you want me to touch on, because that was more of a kind of a broader overview about vendor consolidation and vendor lock-in generally. The other aspect is there's a whole nother module around the math behind vendor consolidation that we run. So if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into each of these different aspects of these legacy vendors, other alternatives, considerations, and things, and how you can leverage them to be able to drive additional discounts within your vendor ecosystem, we have another module that's specifically tailored for that. So back to this, the case for unification, right? This was just a typical scenario where it shows the total operating expense of the current state legacy data estate. And then the disconnect between justifying on a straight line basis moving to that modern data estate. Well, when you take into consideration just not additional complexity or reduction of complexity, not supporting growth and being able to increase the growth and minimize the impact of the growth on the data estate, just the risk factor alone, you can see that down below the total cost of ownership of the data estate is actually the legacy data estate is just over $8 million. And moving to a modern data estate is just over $4 million. So your total ROI on that $2.1 million of spend and the savings that you get is actually just right around just over a half a year. And that's a great ROI for any business justification. Typically, you're going to want to have 2 years of a ROI justification for any kind of a modernization. And that's usually tied to the 5-year amortization of the actual asset itself. So what I wanted to showcase next is this is the actual math. If you take the same analysis, didn't change anything other than the highlighted areas, and talked about the current the current state based on that Databricks. This is, let me run back, this guy. This data estate scenario of the n equals 15 on the bottom left, and then the move to the nice little lake house on the right hand side. So what I did is I just incorporated the n equals 15. Ruthie, do you have another question before I dive into this?
I do, yeah. This question says, given that I'm tasked with meeting our budget before the fiscal year ends, and our current trajectory suggests that we're on track to come in below budget, does it still make sense for us to consider unification on Databricks at this time?
Awesome, great question. 100%. The best part about something like a scenario like that, where you're on track with your budget and you're going to come in and you're projecting that you're going to come in under budget. Nice job, by the way, because most people are not doing that right now, either in this economy or the way that they've structured. So congratulations. The best part about it is if you are currently a Databricks user, oftentimes you'd be able to, most likely, depending on the size and complexity of your Databricks environment and your overall data estate, So take that into consideration as size and complexity do impact this. But if you have say you have, if you're coming to the end of your fiscal year and you're coming up on say your fiscal year is at the half year mark, you'll have 2 months left of your fiscal year and your budget to be able to spend on an effort like this. And it will already be approved and tied to the budget ask that you originally had at the fiscal year, at the beginning of the fiscal year. So that budget ask has already been approved. Most companies, you actually get punished if you overspend and if you underspend. So you need to prioritize that budget to be able to, not only from a performance standpoint and stewardship, but you really want to drive business value. You want to be able to take that budget and drive it into the business, drive it into the technology to be able to show business value. Oftentimes, what people in your situation will do is they'll just dump budget. We see it all the time. Finance will come 2 months before the end of fiscal year and said, hey, by the way, do you remember you have this budget? You need to spend it. And the person goes, oh, geez, I either haven't been able to prioritize that project and it's too long. It's going to cross a fiscal year, so I can't get it done. So I'm just going to give it to a provider and they're going to run some experiments and we're going to test some stuff out. And that's dumping budget. No business value whatsoever. It's a little bit of learning experimentation, but we usually don't recommend it. In a 60-day period, you can actually utilize that budget and then combine it with investment funds from Databricks, the cloud provider, to be able to actually run up to the end of the fiscal year on a 6/30 basis and be able to most likely get either all of or the bulk of your Unity catalog migration done before the end of the fiscal year. So you think about what your commitments, depending on what kind of process you run from a commitment standpoint, you end up saying, yes, I hit all my commitments and I was able to layer over this additional project from a prioritization standpoint for the same dollars. Give me more and give me more than give me what I asked for last year and I'll drive that amount of business value. Give me more and I'll still drive business value. So that's the cool part about it. Where you're at right now is instead of just dumping budget to some vendor that's going to run some data science experiments, actually put it towards something that's going to drive business value. So let's talk about the actual business value of a data migration and a Unity catalog migration. So Unity catalog migrations, we're upfront. There oftentimes is a high level of complexity, and a high level, depending on the size and really how long you've been on Databricks and your maturity with it. Oftentimes you've invested in previous fiscal cycles in technology that's still kind of lingering around. That is precisely why you have to use somebody like us, that specializes and dives deep into all the different aspects of a Unity catalog migration to be able to automate as much as possible, and then to be able to have the experience and the thought process and thought leadership around how to solve all these complexities fast. Because the worst case scenario, anybody that's on here and seeing your titles and where you come from, if you've participated in any kind of a migration, the worst thing you can do is get halfway through a migration and have it go sideways or stop or didn't take something into consideration, because then you have to unwind it. We had one of our clients go through a migration from a legacy system, and they were trying to just stay within the same ecosystem in that legacy provider, Informatica. And they got about halfway through and had to roll it back, and they had to roll it back across the prior version all the way back to on-prem. And the impact of their their accounting department was they lost access to their fiscal reporting for just over 2 weeks, which for a publicly traded company, I mean, you are getting screamed at if you own that environment. So you definitely do not want to be halfway through a migration and have to unwind it, do a bunch of rework, add a bunch of complexity to it because you didn't take it into consideration on the front end. So what we do is we take a look at on the front end. We said I added the operational costs of that N equals 15. So that's just 15 different departments. It equates to 15 different silos, and that might seem a lot depending on where you're at. Oftentimes it's way more than that. And then what I did is I took a 50% reduction of that increase in cost. assuming that there is some kind of labor and cost duplication, that if you have 15 different environments, you're going to be able to spread the operating cost, the labor cost, and the subscription cost over those different departments. You can play with that number from an assumption standpoint. That's just where I landed based on our experience. So, and then I added in another little wrinkle of the average cost of a data breach. The data breach, depending on if you're a really large organization, it can be hundreds of $1 million just in the fines alone. But I just took it, assuming a 100 terabyte environment up top, about what the typical total cost of a data breach is. And I've close personal friends with entrepreneurs in my ecosystem that have experienced this personally. It is not fun. And then, so what I took into consideration, I left the risk factor down below the same. And up on the upper right, I increased the data migration with the cost of a Unity catalog migration. And then I left in the build and customization of it. That takes into consideration a lot of the complexity around it. So those are the only things that I increased. And you can take a look at the direct impact on the TCO analysis below. So I did not change a single thing from the risk factor, any of the multipliers. With Unity Catalog and moving to a modern data estate, you can improve your complexity factor, and you can improve your growth factor as well, right? Because especially with something like Databricks versus something like Snowflake, Databricks scales linearly as you go. But as you go way up at scale, the cost of running something like of Snowflake scales exponentially as you get bigger. And it's a black box. It's a closed ecosystem, so you can't really see why it's doing it. You have to basically turn on everything all at once. With Databricks, it's a little bit harder to get your head around. It's more complex because you get piece by piece. But that's why they actually have a great accelerator ecosystem and partners that are able to stitch it all together. So just taking those into consideration, you take a look at the TCO of a 15 database, data warehouse scenario, and that total cost of ownership is not just 3.1 million, it is $21 million from a risk factor of 4. And then what you get from a total cost of ownership of post-migration, that includes the cost of the migration. Post-migration, you have a total cost of ownership of 4.5 million, which is a 0.38. I believe it's super small on my screen, but an incredibly reduced ROI, which is an easy justification for a Unity catalog migration. So that is the end of the webinar. And I know I went through a lot. I tried to get through it quite a bit. I'll open it up for any kind of final questions, and then we'll talk about what's next.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ryan. I don't see any additional questions, so I'm just going to add in this right over here. If you have any questions, feel free to email info@bpcs.com, and we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. And I'm sure Ryan would be happy to answer any additional questions too. You can connect with him on LinkedIn. He's very active on there, so hop in, and we'd love to get you all connected. And additionally, we will be posting our webinar details, events, great articles, and any product features that we want to add on our social media. So be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn. That's where you will find a lot of information about anything upcoming. But our website has a wealth of resources. So visit bpcs.com to learn more about Blueprint, to learn more about Databricks, and anything else you want to add, Ryan?
Yeah, just real quick, just for anybody, especially for people watching the video, if you haven't attended my inbox, I'm already getting some people reaching out. For anybody that's interested in something like a Unity catalog migration, you can get an assessment for free from us, leveraging our LHO and our Unity catalog migration assessment accelerator. So feel free to reach out. We give you a whole estimation on what it's going to take. And as well, sign up for part 3, the accelerating growth, because this is going to talk about how you've gotten your house in order, you've figured out what you're working with, you've actually then started to make a modernization move. And Here's how you actually leverage, and the monetary value of leveraging all those new features like DBRX and Gen AI and all those different aspects, how you actually know where to invest and know how to invest in those to get the most business value. So definitely sign up for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan, so much for putting all of this together, and appreciate everyone who's taken the time to join us today. We will be sharing the recording on our social media, and anyone who signed up for this webinar will be sure to connect with you and send you a link to the recording directly as well. But as Ryan said, we hope to see you on our next webinar. I did add the link to register for that on the comments right here, so feel free to just click on that, or you can visit us at bpcs.com to get the link on there as well. Once again, thank you everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.